The Coase Theorem is an important part of environmental economics. It is named after Ronald Coase, who was the British economist, taught at the University of Chicago for a long time, received the Nobel Prize for his contributions, lived a long, rich life. I think he was 102 when he passed away a few years ago, working right up until the end. What is the Coase Theorem? The Coase Theorem says if there are no transaction costs, then it doesn't matter who we assign property rights to. We'll end up at an efficient allocation of resources if we're talking about a dispute between the use of this property. What does that actually mean? So if we think about property that's next to each other that has some sort of externality. So Coase, in his famous article, used examples of, say, farmers that were next to each other, or farmers that are next to a railroad. The railroad could send sparks out that would set the hay on fire in the fields. So that's an externality, a negative externality, from the railroad to the farmers. We can also think of examples where there are externalities that go both ways. Say there are farmers next to each other, some of them have cattle and some have corn. The cattle could get out from their farm and come trample and eat the corn. That would be a negative externality. The corn farmer might use a pesticide that actually harms the cattle. That would be a negative externality flowing the other way. Now, often we would think about assigning property rights. So you may have a right not to have cattle come onto your farm if you're a corn farmer. Part of your owning the property that the corn is grown on means that you have the right to exclude people and domestic animals from coming onto that property. So you have the right not to have cattle come trample and eat your crop. That means if the cattle do come over and eat your crop, you can sue the rancher who owns those cattle because they allowed their cattle to come and trespass onto your property and destroyed value in your crops. Now, maybe you have a right not to have pesticide drift onto your property if you're the cattle rancher, right? Part of owning that property is having the right not to have that sort of chemical trespass onto your property and harm your livestock, in which case you could sue the corn farmer for using those pesticides in a way that allowed it to drift over. So those are property rights that are assigned to different people, and based on who holds them, they could sue in court if those property rights are violated in some way. Now, the law has spent a lot of time thinking about who should be given property rights to arrive at an efficient outcome. Coase famously came in and said, you know, it doesn't actually matter who we assign the property rights to. We could give the corn farmer the right not to have cattle trespass on his property, or we could give the rancher the right to allow his cattle to go free range and go wherever they want to. Wherever we assign that property right, we're going to end up with an efficient outcome with the right amount of care taken in trying to prevent those cattle from going into the corn. Why is that? We'll end up there because the farmer and the rancher are going to end up negotiating. They're going to end up saying, if it's worth it, if the corn is worth more than the extra value of the cattle from being able to roam around, of not having to put up fences that keep them away, then the corn farmer is going to end up either holding the right and protecting it, or if the rancher has the right to open range for his cattle, the corn farmer is going to pay the rancher not to allow the cattle to come on. So even though the rancher has the right to let them roam, the corn farmer is willing to pay to have the rancher not allow the cattle to roam. So that was Coase's big insight, is that you give the right to the farmer or you give the right to the rancher. If it makes sense to have the cattle stay out of the corn, it's going to end up happening no matter who you give the right to, because there will be this bargaining that goes on between the parties and they'll end up at the efficient outcome. So the law doesn't have to spend so much time thinking about who should hold the property rights. Instead, the important thing is making sure there are property rights and people are allowed to bargain with them, trade with them. And that's where the transaction cost part comes in. So this Coase theorem says without major transaction costs, this bargaining can happen and we'll end up with a good outcome. But that's a big caveat, because transaction costs are all around us. So transaction costs mean, okay, if it's a rancher and a farmer and they're brothers and they've known each other forever and they know each other's businesses and they like each other, getting them to come together and negotiate and make this deal, probably going to happen, right? Their transaction costs are going to be really low because they already know each other, they already know the situation, they care about each other, they like each other. Now, if the farmer and cattle rancher are, again, brothers, but they've been in a feud for decades because one went into the farming business and one went into the ranching business and they just can't stand each other, well, then your transaction costs for negotiating are going to be a lot higher, right? We may have someone being stubborn and holding out things that could prevent us from arriving at the efficient outcome, depending on who we give the right to initially, because they may be kind of too stubborn to come together and negotiate. Even if it would make sense for them economically to do so, they may not be driven by just that economic consideration. And so that would be a really high transaction cost. We see that in divorce cases all the time, right? Or child custody sort of situations. Parties are motivated by things beyond financial incentives. It makes bargaining a much, much more complicated thing. The transaction costs are much higher, which often means the lawyers who are involved end up getting a lot more money, right? Because the lawyers have much more work to do to help people arrive at an agreement. That means the lawyer spends more time on it and bills out more, and you can literally see the transaction costs with that lawyer bill, right? But transaction costs can take other forms too. It's not just lawyer bills. We often see situations where we have dozens or even hundreds of people. So if a factory is polluting the air and that air gets blown over a neighborhood that has hundreds of families in it, getting those families to come together and to be able to bargain with the factory over the amount of pollution that they release into the air, it's much more complicated than if we had two factories that are bargaining with each other, right? So having a bunch of parties, it makes it difficult to coordinate, and we run into problems with free riding, with public goods that we talked about earlier, where parties have an incentive to not invest their own energy or money into this effort, instead to just free ride on the efforts and money that other people put into it. So we run into problems like that if we're trying to coordinate a bunch of people to come together to negotiate. So that's transaction costs there, right? So there are lots of transaction costs around us, which is why the Coase theorem explicitly says that we have to assume transaction costs are low for this result to definitely hold. In the real world, we know we have transaction costs, so really it comes down to thinking about how big those are, and maybe thinking about how could we facilitate people coming together to bargain over these property rights. The other big thing that economists and lawyers these days think about is, might we be able to create property rights in something that allows for this sort of bargaining to occur? So we see this with something like the fishing industry. So there's a commons problem there, where every fisherman has an incentive to catch as much as they can, well, enough to maximize their personal profits, but that may be overfishing this common pool resource. One way to deal with that is to assign property rights in that common pool resource. So this stock of fish, instead of being a common resource, actually gets divvied out to people in the form of something like individually tradable quotas. So each farmer has a right, or each fisherman, excuse me, has a right to harvest a certain share of that year's harvest. Now, with those tradable quotas, that means they could actually sell that right to catch those fish to a different fisherman. So the idea with these tradable quotas is we've created property rights and given them to fishermen who can now negotiate with each other over how much they're going to fish, what areas, and we're much more likely to arrive at an efficient use of this resource. What was a common pool resource is now a restricted resource, and we're allowing those fishermen to trade things, which allows for this bargaining to occur. So creating property rights in something can allow the Coase Theorem essentially to work. So the Coase Theorem is often put forward as an alternative to traditional regulation to protect environmental amenities. If we have well-defined property rights in something, and we try to work to minimize transaction costs of bargaining between the parties involved, we don't necessarily have to have a really active role for the government to come in and tell factories that they can't pollute, or to tell fishermen that they can't catch as many fish. The factories or the fishermen will actually arrive at those decisions on their own if they're surrounded by incentives that allow them to work with well-established property rights and negotiate with other parties involved whenever there are externalities that spill across. All right, so that is the Coase Theorem and a little bit more about transaction costs and why they matter in environmental economics.